Thank you so much. I want to turn first to Allison Urban. She doesn't know that I'm going to do this, but Allison and I have been together for 25 years. I first knew her when she was a child. And Allison, tomorrow is Associates Day, right? For everybody in this country, but Allison is so much more than that to Edgar, Dobie, and I. She really is a chief of staff. And she's a chief of staff for our board, for our staff, and for artists. So Allison, bless you. She's drafted almost every single one of the speeches that I've ever given. We go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth in this crazy quilt. And you're brilliant, and everybody should know it. Woo! To be at the helm of a great and adventurous theater means tackling big ideas. Commissioning new works for the stage is one of the most radical acts that a theater can take, because the theater is taking a risk and bringing forth a hope that a great new play will be birthed. This is from a speech from Jimmy Carter in Camp David by Lawrence Wright, which we commissioned and produced in 2014. I know what land means to a people. My family's been farming in Georgia for 170 years. I have a deep spiritual connection to that red clay. My ancestors are buried in it. I can't imagine what it would be like if someone tried to take that land away from us. And yet many times when I'm out in the field, especially after a big rain, I come upon an arrowhead or a spear point, an artifact of another civilization that once lived there, the Creek Indians. It was their land, and we took it from them, shamefully, dispossessed an entire people. Christians did that. Camp David was really the beginning of an incredible adventure called Power Plays. But before I go forward to Power Plays, I need to go way back to my time at Perseverance Theater in Juneau, Alaska, where I was the founder and artistic director for 19 years before I came to Arena. And because of my unusual taste for new plays, because remember, during those days, almost no one was doing new work. At Perseverance, we produced at least one new play a season. Over my 19 years at Perseverance, we commissioned over 36 plays and created the Great Alaskan Play Competition all over the state. This photo is from Water of Life by Bill Ray. That was back in 1979, when most American theaters were doing classics and work from Europe. Early on, I wanted to change that. One of the most powerful plays we commissioned at Perseverance Theater won the Pulitzer. But it was the play that almost didn't happen. Perseverance and the Pew Foundation had created a commission for Paula Vogel to write a play about the castrati with Cherry Jones in the lead role. And we were thrilled about the possibility. And so was Cherry. Paula came to Juneau to write, and I saw her get off the plane, and I could tell she was pregnant with her ideas and ready to write. I was thrilled. But Paula said, I've decided I don't want to write the castrati play. I'm ready to write How I Learned to Drive. Now, I knew this play because over the previous decade, Paula had driven me in her car acting out many of the monologues. I swallowed my disappointment about the castrati play and said, great, when are you going to write? She said, now. We got her over to her basement apartment in Juneau. She put up all of her images and set out her beloved cigars and put on her music. And within 2 weeks, How I Learned to Drive was born. The play she wrote in 1997 is almost exactly what an audience sees now, and it taught me a really important lesson. Follow the artist. Because the artist always knows where they're going. You can support, you can nudge, you can give inspiration, but it's their job to write what is within them. My first big idea came when I came to Arena in 1998, and it was to focus on American plays, American ideas, American stories. Arena had the incredible legacy of Zelda Fitzhandler for 40 years, of mostly classics with an occasional new play. For example, the premiere of The Great White Hope ended up being a tremendous success, but that was more the exception than it was the norm. New work at Arena was a rarity. Indeed, it was a rarity countrywide. And when Doug Wager was artistic director for 7 years, he had a more contemporary flair and more interest in new work. Frankly, this was a city that mostly looked over its shoulder at the Brits to see what they were doing instead of looking in our own backyard, with the notable exceptions of Woolly Mammoth and New Playwrights Theater, where I cut my teeth on new work when I was a student here in the early 70s. So when I came to Arena, I turbocharged the idea of new work, because I knew our backyard was rich, it was fertile, it was diverse, and was ready to spring forward with American writers. This opened us up to a diversity of artists, and because of this central change in mission, our audiences became much more diverse. You see, your repertoire defines you and defines the audiences you have within a surprisingly short period of time. There was quite a bit of stress around changing the repertoire at Arena, both the focus solely on American artists and bringing a big emphasis to new work. But as I said to audiences and staff, okay, really, we have 70 theaters here and plenty that are doing classics. You could go see the work there. Let's populate everybody. In my first season at Arena, we produced 2 world premieres, Expecting Isabel by Lisa Loomer, directed by Doug Wager, and Thunder Knocking on the Door, written and directed by Keith Glover, with music by Kemp Moe and Anderson Edwards. There's the wonderful Marva Hicks, who just died about a year ago. In my second season, we produced the premiere of Charles Randolph Wright's Blue, directed by Sheldon Epps. So we jumped right in. And now Blue is ready to be produced in New York with Felicia Rashad directing. So how wild, huh? Here she is in the play, and then 22 years later, she'll be directing it. But in the beginning, truly our smallest audiences were for new work because audiences were afraid of what's new. Special thanks to Drs. Elliott and Lily Gardner Feldman for not being afraid of the new, and for creating an endowment which supports the continuation of Arena's commissioning program and to bring a steady stream of new work to these stages. The Feldman Endowment was created to provide a permanent support for 3 purposes. 1, that in every theater season, Arena Stage will commission at least 1 new play for the American canon. 2, Arena will produce at least 1 new play. And 3, will present an annual lecture at Arena Stage, usually by a playwright, on the creative process. Well, I'm not a playwright, but I'm honored to be the first lecture. That's me at a first rehearsal. The joy of starting work on a new play is infectious and always scary. It takes metal to do new work. It takes guts to do new work. It takes a lot of things to do new work because there's no path. You're creating the path. We currently have 14 commissions that are in various stages of being researched or written. Since I've been at Arena, we have commissioned, how many do you think? 49 new plays. Yes, Arena Stage is a powerhouse in supporting new plays in America. I got really jealous when I heard that other theaters were commissioning a bunch of plays. And I came back to Edgar and I said, we gotta do more. Where's Edgar? Where's Edgar? He's somewhere. Where are you? Oh, Edgar. I said, we gotta do more. We have to move into this in a more direct way because we were losing some of the best writers who were working with other theaters and writing plays for years and years and years. So we just kept moving. There was a very early commission from 1999, John Strand, for an adaptation of Tom Walker, which we produced in 2001 during my 3rd season as artistic director. Skip to now, this season, we produced 2 world premiere plays, The High Ground, which you've seen recently, and Exclusion, and next season we have scheduled 3 brand new plays. More on them in a bit. So you see, you're going to have a walk down memory lane for many of you who have seen some of these productions or wish you had seen them. So you actually need to buy a season ticket in order to be able to do that. I'm sure communications would be happy that I just did that pitch. The creation of the power plays was another of my big ideas, but it didn't happen overnight. Big ideas never do. Early in my tenure in 2002, we commissioned Tazewell Thompson. What I said to Taz is, I really want to begin commissioning plays about the presidents, since this is their hometown for a few years. And I don't care if the story just has a president who wanders in the room, as long as the world of the play is affected by the president. The commission was dated in 2002. 11 years later, Mary T. and Lizzie Kay was produced in this theater in 2013 about the relationship between Mary Todd Lincoln and Elizabeth Keckley. But that was really an early precursor to my thinking around the power play cycle. In 2003, we commissioned Sarah Ruhl after doing a reading of her play, Eurydice. Sarah had been working on a major project called Passion Plays that already had 2 full-length plays. I met her at Brown University through Paula Vogel, and she was clearly a bright light. She was interested in completing her cycle with a 3rd play, and so I thought, all right, let's see where she's going. So let's follow. The first play in her trilogy took place in northern England in 1575, when Queen Elizabeth stopped the Passion Play from being performed. The second play took place in Oberammergau, Germany, in 1934, when many of the actors were part of the Nazi Party. Hitler arrived and loved the Passion Play because of its depiction of Jews. The 3rd play took place in Spearfish, South Dakota, in the post-Vietnam era with Ronald Reagan as a force in the play. Now, Sarah originally thought of the cycle as actually 3 separate productions. But when working on our commission for the 3rd, I proposed to her the radical idea of combining all 3 plays in one evening. So we workshopped the plays, and after the first day's reading, Sarah said, yes, it's possible, and it's strong in this way. A gutsy move on her part. The end product of Passion Play took the audience through a journey of time and philosophy, and was well over 4 hours long with snacks in between. It was a mammoth undertaking for our staff. From the first moment 25 years ago when I came to Arena, I was blessed with a top-notch production staff, board, and dynamic administration, because we can create anything on stage. Theater artists love to work at Arena because their dream on paper can be realized down to the smallest, tiniest detail. And believe me, new work is the most complex to create. Why do you think that is? It's because there's no roadmap. You're creating it first, so your imagination has to be in its finest form. Designers, directors, actors have come to Arena and created magic, achieving amazing feats and built their dreams. We have many of the best craftspeople, artisans, administrators, and board members in the country, and we make the magic together. I remember looking for other local stories, like when we commissioned Culture Clash, a satirical performance comedy troupe whose play Radio Mambo Arena produced in 1999. We commissioned them to write a piece based on Washington, D.C., and timing is everything. September 11th intervened. Led by member Richard Montoya, they wrote Anthems, Culture Clash in the District, and incorporated comedy into the fear and shock of being in the Capitol on that fateful day in 2001. We produced forgotten, unproduced plays from the Library of Congress by famous American authors, like Intimations for Saxophone by Sophie Treadwell, championed by literary manager Michael Kinghorn, and Polk County by Zora Neale Hurston, never been produced before. In a version perfected by director Kyle Donnelly and literary manager Kathy Madison, and we kept commissioning more and more writers, including Robert Schenken, Nilo Cruz, Marcus Gardley. For Arena's 50th anniversary, we put together a huge and wild conference called Who Needs New Plays? Under a big white tent in the parking lot. It was a day-and-a-half extravaganza of speakers, panels, discussion, shared ideas. There were people like Wendy Wasserstein, Zelda was there, Michael Kahn, Ken Ludwig, Jim Nicola, Jerry Patch, Nelson Presley, as well as a representative from the Library of Congress, Alice Burney, who showed us the Polk County script, and a psychologist, Justin Frank, to find out from audience members why they were so afraid of new plays. We actually had a fainting couch in one room. Lie down and talk about why are you afraid of the new. Business officer manager Richard Schaefer's jumped in to be the conference organizer, and it was a perfect way to celebrate Arena's 50 years and look ahead to the next 50 years. Greg Henry, who you all know from the Kennedy Center, started the Page to Stage at the Kennedy Center because of this conference, and many more local theaters began to produce new work. And now our new play audiences are some of our largest instead of some of our smallest. I think great theater is like grapes. They grow together. And that's part of the reason why we have a great theater city, because everybody grows and changes and morphs together. Years later, we spearheaded a national coalition around the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. Liz Lerman brought the idea to me because she'd been reading new scholarship on women and the war and was intrigued to discover that there were over 400 documentations of women cross-dressing and becoming soldiers. 5 professional theaters, Arena, ART, Center Stage, the Alliance Theater Company, and Oregon Shakespeare Festival, paired with 5 universities, and commissioned new work about civil conflict, past and present, all over the country. We produced Our War here, commissioning 25 monologues from 25 playwrights, reflecting on the impact of the Civil War and directed by Anita Maynard Losh. Often it actually takes 2 or 3 productions before a new play or musical is really born. Because a writer doesn't really know what they've created until they're in front of a paying audience. People often think that you find that out in workshops or readings. You really don't, because everybody's just excited to be there. And they're right up on the actors and they think whatever's happening is brilliant. We take it to a paying audience and you know right away what you want, right? It was with this in mind that we created this beautiful theater space, the Arlene and Robert Kogod Cradle. Now early on, people thought we should have a black box when we rebuilt this whole center. But I argued against the idea, instead pushing for a small, beautifully outfitted theater. You're in it right now. Why should new plays be relegated to the worst space in a theater? I wanted them to be elevated. That was the idea. This theater is designed to cradle the risks that artists take on these early first, second, and third productions of new work. It's a place to experiment, to soar, to fail, to pick yourself up, try something new. It's a place to reinvent the classics, and for our community engagement programs. It is a sacred space, and you feel it as you're embraced by these beautiful basket-woven walls. A very notable example of a second production is Next to Normal. Encouraged by Marc Chagall in 2008, I traveled to New York to see what was being called a disappointing but maybe important musical at Second Stage, and the hair on the back of my head went up while watching the musical. It's always the best sign for me. Michael Greif, the director and a good friend, and I met backstage and talked about the problematic songs and scenes. Producer David Stone was looking for a place to incubate Next to Normal after its New York run. We partnered with him to support significant changes to the musical for production in Crystal City while our new center was being created. This support and production then propelled the show back to New York to Tony Award success. It won the Pulitzer, rare for a musical. So as I was evolving, I searched fiercely for DC's voice in theater. And I realized that our unique voice is political. Politics is Washington, Washington is politics. Our main course meal, our red meat, our bloodlines. We're the city that loves to talk politics from the first waking moment to when our heads hit the pillow. Now this idea was almost always not met with open arms. To be political means to risk saying the things that people don't like to hear. Many said I was crazy, that people were not interested in political plays because they live in DC. Well, I think that's exactly why these plays are right for a DC voice in theater. Pow! And it helped drive this organization because of those political plays. And now you will see all over the city people producing political plays. The landscape has changed. Out of fear and combating and facing fear, we have revelation. Radical acts. Power Plays is an ambitious commissioning initiative developing 25 plays and musicals from a diverse mix of writers, composers, and lyricists taking on American stories of politics and power, exploring the people, events, and ideas that have helped shape our country's narrative and identity. With one show per decade since 1770 through the 2010s, these works show America at its best and at its worst. It's been bracing to bring people together who may not otherwise find themselves in the same room and introduce audiences to historical figures or issues and ideas they may not know or understand. And what better place to take on this juicy initiative than in our nation's capital at Arena Stage, where we focus on American plays, American artists, American ideas. To have a great theater, you need great artists and great writers. We held the launch of the initiative with a panel discussion with several of the earliest commissioned writers. Mary Catherine Nagel, Nathan Allen Davis, Jacqueline Lawton, John Strand, moderated by Rita Braver. Writers in the theater are very different from writers in film or television. In those forms, the director is a seminal artist. In the theater, it's the writer. And the other difference in the theater is it actually takes longer in the theater to write than it does for television or film. The gestation process is longer. You know, people keep asking me, when's the great Trump play going to happen? Well, the great AIDS play didn't happen until Angels in America. And that was 10 years after we saw As Is and Normal Heart and Baltimore Waltz and all the other plays that were the precursors to that. We'll see the same thing with the Trump play. The first plays will be more informational, and as it expands, they will become deeper and deeper and deeper and richer. We helped launch of this initiative, as I mentioned, with this panel discussion. And what I love about being with writers is the idea that I've always been drawn to cycles, passages of time in one's life, the turning of the seasons. And cycles in playwriting can represent these passages and provide great context for our lives. August Wilson, probably the most famous example, with his American Century cycle, 10 plays over 10 decades. Eugene O'Neill tried to make a cycle of plays and didn't succeed. Bill Rauch had an ambitious cycle initiative when he was at Oregon Shakespeare Festival with American Revolutions, the United States History Cycle. We've also created bodies of work through the American Giants Festival here at Arena, like August Wilson, Lillian Hellman, Edward Albee, in which we produced main stage productions and special events, like reading all 45 of Edward Albee's plays, which he was thrilled about because he said nobody had ever wanted to do that before. Radical acts. We've had a great response from playwrights, even if they eventually opted not to take a commission, because a writer actually has to be driven to write about a particular idea or it does not work. Commissions sometimes don't work by people commissioning plays or projects because they're too narrow in their thinking. And because they want somebody to only write a certain something. Well, you can't do that, as the Paula Vogel example gave us all. Our definition is pretty broad. One agent asked if political meant it had to be biographical or distinctly on a current hot topic. Well, for us, it could be about movements, ideas, historical legends, undiscovered heroes, you name it. And often the plays will not only be about the particular decade in the past, but also about right now. Otherwise, why would the writer want to write about it? Every one of these plays has repercussions today. Just before the pandemic, in December 2019, we got the Power Play writers together with Washington thinkers for a Power Play Summit with Ken Lin, pictured here, who wrote Exclusion, which you will be seeing very, very soon on stage, which generated deep conversations and meaningful connections. Each one of these plays is the culmination of years of gestation, research, imagining, drafting, redrafting, designing, reimagining, rewriting, building, and finally rehearsing and performing. And there's probably another rewrite or two in there somewhere. Sometimes we connect writers to the Library of Congress. Sometimes our literary department does amazing research. Always we do a reading. Often we do at least 1 week's worth of a workshop. Sometimes two. Often we bring in experts. We're in DC after all. For example, the Camp David cast visited the State Department and met Senator John Kerry. Nina Totenberg, NPR's Supreme Court expert, and Joan Busepik, who wrote the biography on Justice Scalia, came to hear a first reading of The Originalist and gave John Strand important insights. Nina's also coming back again to give insight into Colleen Sinnett Jennings' new play about Justice Ginsburg, Kiki, and the First Read. These plays are often about Washington, and many people sitting in the House may have contributed to the story you see on the stage. Even though it's out of the writer's imagination, we want to get the salient details right. These stories educate, they challenge, they promote understanding, they illuminate, they can change minds and open minds. And we welcome dialogue and fierce conversation because we believe that as a nation we become stronger when all voices are heard. Our greatest gift is the right to free speech. And I think it's our purpose as theater makers. So let's talk about some of the power plays we've produced so far. Camp David by Lawrence Wright for the decade of the 1970s. And I love starting here because this play got the power play ball rolling in an immensely significant way. You know, you see this man all the way over on the side. He played Anwar Sadat. Khaled Nabawi, major star in the Middle East, was one of the people who really led the revolution. And you never know what it's like to work with an Egyptian who has 4 million on his Twitter account until he comes into your office and fights with you for an hour about the wig that we had to have built for him. He refused to cut his big frothy hair because he had a big film shoot. And Edgar will remember this, so will Allison. We had him in the chair every day for 3.5 to 4 hours before he went on. And he was fine. The gestation for this play came from Jerry Rafshoon, former director of communications for Jimmy Carter. He connected with the great journalist and playwright Lawrence Wright about writing a piece around Carter and the Camp David Peace Accords. Jerry came to Arena to see if we would commission it, and we jumped at the opportunity to work with Larry and tell this important story. You may remember his best-selling work, Looming Tower, Al-Qaeda, and the Road to 9/11. I was delighted to be able to interview President and Mrs. Carter about their experiences at their home in Plains, Georgia, with Jerry Rafshoon. An amazing experience. President and Mrs. Carter and Mrs. Sadat came to see the play on opening night, and we held what was, I would call, almost a state dinner at Arena. Opening night, the Carters sat behind Suzanne and me, tears streaming down their faces at the curtain call. It was unforgettable. A few years later, Larry Wright wrote an entire book about Camp David, 13 Days in September, from the research he had done for Arena's production. I love it when we provide the impetus for these writers to extend their productions and research. Quick story about President Carter. Because he was a submariner, he always wore his watch kind of turned around like this. If you were 2 minutes early, you were late. And we went out to the church where he was always one of the speakers in the church. And it was a spaghetti dinner. And always, once a military man, always a military man. What did he say to me? Molly, there's a hole in the line. You get in the line over there, and you get over there, and you get your plate, and you get your spaghetti. And I asked him, what made you fall in love with Rosalind? He said, no one has ever asked me that question before. He said, I think it was the moment when I saw the flip of her skirt. Aww. I know, kind of beautiful, right? To say that Camp David was one of the most important stories we staged here at Arena is a complete understatement. In this city, in this time when our legislatures are deadlocked, it's important to be reminded when people from very different cultures, religions, and perspectives sat down to forge an agreement. It took fire and metal and guts for them to create this document. And here we are, still only 90 minutes away from Camp David, where once upon a time, politicians risked their lives and careers to create a lasting peace agreement. Let's hope this proves it can happen again. The Originalists by John Strand from the 1990s. Here's a speech by Justice Scalia. I was in an opera, a few years back, Strauss, the chorus. I wonder sometimes if I had followed in the great tradition of Italian tenors, a life in the theater. No. Where would this country be without me? I've taken the whole of Washington, monuments, bureaucrats, history and all, and moved it solidly, measurably to the right. And yes, I sometimes performed from the bench, shocking the keepers of the liberal flame in this country. Well, let me tell you something. They're easy to shock. But that's the secret of my charm. I tell people what they don't want to hear. It's also what makes me a monster. That's how half the country sees me. Aggressive, combative, law and order conservative. Which am I? The play is a story of a bright, liberal Harvard Law School graduate embarking on a nerve-wracking clerkship with a conservative justice. And she discovers him to be both an infuriating sparring partner and an unexpected mentor. So it was quite a risk to take on a conservative judge. John Strand's goal was to strive for a middle ground, and when he came to me with this idea and already imagined Ed Giraud in the lead, well, the hair on the back of my head went up. There's that important response again. I was nervous and exhilarated. There were longtime audience members who refused to come and see the play, at the same time saying that theater should challenge people. Some donors pulled their support because of the subject matter. Even though it was difficult, Edgar Dobie, our executive producer, and I knew the project went far beyond anyone's distaste or funding because we knew how important the subject was. Provocative, yes. Exhilarating, yes. Dangerous, yes. Just my type of theater. The play was a big success and traveled to 4 other theaters, including, thanks to Beth, off-Broadway. Somebody got some applause back there, Beth. Ed Giraud truly inhabited the role and became friendly with the justice himself. They ate lunch together, went skeet shooting together. Ed smartly connected with Justice Scalia through the investigation of language. Scalia parsed the Constitution. Ed parsed Shakespeare. They bonded, and amazingly, their families came from the same small region of Italy. When Justice Scalia died, news agencies mistakenly chose pictures of Ed in the originals. And you've always been a much prettier version of Justice Scalia. He was that much of a doppelganger. The family invited Ed to the funeral, and people did a double take as they walked past him, as if Scalia's ghost. We all learned a lot about ourselves and about listening through the process. Justice Ginsburg was interviewed by me on stage twice in Washington, D.C. and New York. We talked about the Supreme Court system, her experience with Scalia, and their great friendship. Despite being from completely different political points of view and her thoughts of past court cases she'd been involved with. When I asked her, why were they such great friends? She said, he made me laugh. And that he made me a better jurist because of the way he attacked my drafts. Times have changed politically since we premiered The Originalist in March 2015. Justice Scalia passed away in February 2016. Justice Ginsburg passed away in September 2020. We're more polarized now than we were then. Is the dream of finding a middle ground simply naive? I don't think so. And I believe John Strand agrees with me. At moments like this story is even more important to experience. To listen, to take time to understand an opposing view, to get to the heart of complex matters and find a way to work together is a component of practicing free speech. Radical acts. I think I'll have a drink. Sovereignty by Mary Catherine Nagel from the 1830s. Is a man to be denounced for his opinions? If a man sees a cloud charged with rain, thunder, and storm and urges his people to take care, is that man to be hated or respected? That was John Ridge in Sovereignty. This power play travels the intersection of personal and political truths, historic and present struggles by juxtaposing the 1830s and the present. Sarah Ridge Polson, a young Cherokee lawyer in present time, is fighting to restore her nation's jurisdiction and must confront the ever-present ghosts of her grandfathers and the Violence Against Women Act in a contemporary way. Americans are remarkably naive about Native Americans and Native American culture. Sovereignty is about a world most Americans know absolutely nothing about. And Washington, D.C. and Arena Stage is the perfect home to premiere a play about treaties, broken treaties, and the deep government-to-government relationship between Indian country and the U.S. government. Did you know that the U.S. government has over 300 treaties with Indian country? And every single treaty has been broken. Did you know that 20 to 30 million people were massacred here? Did you know that there's only 3 million Native American people left? Including my partner, Suzanne Blue Star Boy. Where are you, Suzanne? So Mary Catherine Nagel's play asks the question, how far would you go to protect your family and your people? The Native American voice is an essential one. Mary Catherine Nagel is a full-time lawyer specializing in federal Indian law and appellate litigation, and nearly a full-time playwright. She wrote this beautiful and challenging play which illuminated the Native American experience for a lot of people who had no idea. And they certainly had no idea about President Jackson. An audience member said to me, I'm an educated person and I feel ignorant. So I fact-checked you during intermission. And I found that the play was correct. I need to keep thinking and learning. Come to Arena Stage to learn history. Snow Child, with a book by John Strand, lyrics by Georgia Stitt, and music by Bob Banghart and Georgia Stitt for the 1920s. The silence is the worst. Days and nights that I fill with all the thoughts I can't bear to think. Most every living thing has a sense to clear out of her now before winter gets its full jaws into you, except for me. The story is about Mabel and Jack reeling from the loss of an unborn child as they struggle to rebuild their lives, even as the fissures between them continue to widen. Everything changes suddenly when they're visited by a wild, mysterious girl who embodies the dark woods that surround their cabin. Now, this unknowable expanse of Alaska was my home for almost half my life and remains a retreat for me from the heady politics of Washington, D.C. When I first read the novel by E.O. and Ivy, I was struck by her ability to capture the wildness of Alaska, something I knew our audiences would be eager to experience. This is a classic fairy tale with a mystical feel, perfect for the stage. Because this musical is about the relationship between people and the environment and the westward movement of America, it is psychologically a power play. Our creative team of Strand, Georgia Stitt, and Banghart each have unique voices, and the process for developing this new musical was as challenging as the landscape. This production was especially innovative because of our use of puppetry from Eric Wright and Emily DeCola, creating fantastic beings like this massive horse on stage, a swan and a magical fox on stage. The world of Alaska in the 1920s was created through a sound design technique that pulled nature sound into the surround sound from sound designer Rock Lee, who first worked for Arena as a teacher at Camp Arena Stage. The High Ground, inspired by 1910s by Nathan Allen Davis, speech by the woman in black. My husband died here on this hill. You saw it. You saw him die here. You saw when he was shot. They shot him many times. You saw it. Do you see it? I didn't see it. I could not bear to look. I could not bear to look on what I'd looked on so many times before. I heard the bullets in my mind's eye. I saw what my mother saw. I saw what my mother's mother saw. For I am my mother's return. And she was seeing her mother's return, who was her mother's return, and back and on to the beginning. I think you hear me. I think you understand. My husband died here. This play is a lyrical story of the mysteries of love and loss. More than a century after the Tulsa Race Massacre killed hundreds and destroyed the prosperous Greenwood District, a black man in Army garb still stands his ground on present-day Tulsa Standpipe Hill. Nathan Allen Davis's provocative play closed earlier this month after a successful run in this very theater. Nathan knew from the start he wanted to dig into the then hidden story of the race riots of Tulsa, Oklahoma, a horrific event in 1921 where an upper-class black neighborhood nicknamed Black Wall Street because it was the wealthiest black neighborhood in America was massacred. It was one of those events that had been left out of the history books, and most Americans had never heard of it at that time. We wanted the power plays to include undiscovered stories. Arena's support of Nathan's research led him to be an expert on the topic. He wrote several major and very different drafts of this play, leading to a television short series on this subject as well. Stay tuned for when that's going to air. So in the time since Nathan began his commission 7 years ago, the world changed and woke up to the hidden history like the Tulsa Race Massacre. The 100th anniversary of the event was commemorated in 2021, and Nathan was at the forefront of scholars. I'm proud that Arena had a small part to play in bringing this lost history to the public. We have commissioned 24 of the 25 decades now, with new commissions this season for Lady Dane Figaro Aditi, Taylor Mack, and Deepak Kumar. Each commission takes its own journey, and sometimes it's years, as you can see, before the play is ready for the stage. We have several other writers in the midst of their work, including Idris Goodwin writing a piece around the 1860s called Scarfoot Lives, Octavio Solis in the 1840s around the Treaty of Guadalupe, Vera Starbard with a story from the 1930s with the Tlinkits in Alaska. What a huge journey it's been for all of us. Lauren Yee, whose award-winning play Cambodian Rock Band opens arenas next season, is working on a piece for the decade of the 1950s. It's a play about the blacklisting of certain Hollywood artists and how a dinner party can change everything. This is a co-commission with Second Stage in New York. And these partnerships are ways to extend the life of the piece, first being produced here and then in New York. Hawaiian native Lee Cataluna is writing an exciting piece about Queen Emma from the 1870s. How many of you have been to Hawaii? Just raise your hands. Okay, interesting. She was the widow of the King of Hawaii, who died in 1871 and set off an election controversy. Queen Emma was the favorite candidate of the people. However, the voters were members of the legislature, not the public, and they preferred the favored candidate of the American business and military interests. Emma's supporters rioted after the election with many fatalities, including destruction of the courthouse and American warships in the harbor. And yes, the January 6th insurrection in DC inspired this true story. Another exciting piece is called My Way. It's a power play musical from the 1940s around FDR's administration by Zake Zadok and Emily Feldman. No relationship to both of you. It's a musical about Lorena Hickok and Eleanor Roosevelt's romance, exploring how their relationship changes the trajectory of their individual lives and of American history. They hope to understand the culture these women came from and to make connections about how the challenges they faced manifest today. Radical acts. Other power plays we have produced. Intelligence by Jacqueline Lawton for the decade of the 2000s. Inspired by true events, Intelligence follows one woman's journey to serve her country, protect her family, and fight for the truth and justice. A covert operative tasked with protecting the national security of the United States post 9/11 finds her cover blown while she races to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. JQA by Aaron Posner from the 1790s. Complicated, passionate, and difficult. John Quincy Adams was a brilliant diplomat, ineffective one-term president, and congressman known for his eloquence, arrogance, and integrity. And this unique, highly theatrical play imagines key confrontations between JQA and some of America's most dynamic figures. Representing the 1980s, Celia and Fidel by Eduardo Machado. Imbued with magical realism, Celia and Fidel imagines a fight between Cuba's most influential female revolutionary and its most notorious political leader, as Fidel Castro grapples between his desire to maintain power and do what's best for his country. Change Agent by Craig Lucas. During the volatile 1960s, one woman influenced American policy and in turn, world events through her friendships, loves, and proximity to power. Change Agent pulls back the curtain on an artist who fought long and hard to keep the humanity in politics and expand the consciousness of a nation. Coming up next in the Krieger, Exclusion, 1880s by Ken Lin. Monologue by Katie. And this also all takes place in contemporary Hollywood, but it harkens back to the Chinese Exclusion Act. So Katie says, no, this is your interpretation of my book. And you've hired a bunch of your friends who look exactly like you and think exactly like you to tell my story. And what you're making is a cheap facsimile of my book, because that is your depth, because the utter limit of your humanity stops at my knees. What you're making of my book is the only story you're capable of telling, because this is your obsession, justifying the emptiness of your existence and celebrating the empty fates who would permit you to do so little with so much. An award-winning historian is thrilled when her best-selling book about the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 is optioned for a miniseries by a Hollywood mogul. Her euphoria turns to disillusionment as she finds herself constantly defending its authenticity in the struggle between what's true and what sells. I've just seen her run this production, as I said, in the rehearsal hall, and I can promise you it's excellent. Next season, you will witness the premiere of Kia Corthron's power play, Tempestuous Elements, about the legendary educator and activist, Anna Julia Cooper. How many of you know her? Have heard of her? A few. Did you know she's the only woman quoted on the US passport? The cause of freedom is not the cause of a race, or a sect, or a party, or a class. It is the cause of humankind, the very birthright of humanity. And this is text now from Tempestuous Elements. Anna. I am my sister's keeper should be the hearty response of every man and woman of the race. And this conviction should purify and exalt the narrow, selfish, and petty personal aims of life into a noble and sacred purpose. She was a genius writer, speaker, educator, and principal of the important M Street Theater, yes, downtown in Washington, D.C., which was an institution for African American students in Washington, D.C. Cooper championed academic and university learning for black children when the establishment wanted her to keep them focused only on trades and manual labor. Another touchstone to the present, when, as we well know and are living through, whole groups of people trying to control what is available to be taught to students and learned. Control their minds, and you control the people. Tempestuous Elements takes this idea on. So when we finish this cycle of play, we'll have touchstones on people and ideas that have formed us as Americans. Theater is the most present of art forms because it's grounded in the reality of language. It exists only in this instance, and it's been playing out in front of us while acting out the passions of a particular character in a story which has resonance for our lives. When speaking of all these successes, we have to acknowledge that not everything goes the way you want it to. Commissions can go wrong, and that's always sad for me and sad for the playwright as well. Sometimes the play simply doesn't meet expectations, and there has to be the willingness on all sides to make difficult decisions about how to move forward. Playwrights need to be collaborators as well and be willing to take criticism and feedback. Sometimes it's very hard for a creative artist to do that. They dig in their heels, they're defensive, not willing to listen, not willing to adapt, and sometimes we've had to let commissions go. We let the writers know we'd love to have them take the projects to other theaters to have them produced elsewhere. In one instance, the writer did multiple rewrites on a play and changed very little. Twice we held readings, but soon it was clear they loved their play and didn't see what needed to be done. It's a really difficult situation because we have relationships with these artists over many years and other projects. However, it's also important to let the project lead, and if it's not right, it's just not right. Another example of timing is everything. We had a commission in development through the pandemic, and as you know, all of our emotions and sensitivities shifted. In a reading of the play, there were questions about characterization, and the playwright responded defensively. It became a situation that the rest of the team behind the play no longer felt that they could support the project. Power had shifted. The playwright might have once been able to be the central leader around the play, but now we have a broader understanding of the importance of other points of view. Although Power Plays is our cycle, this is not the only new play commissioning work we've been creating. So you all probably remember during the pandemic, we pivoted to creating original online content, like the picture here of May 22nd, 2020, and 51st State. We commissioned monologues based on actual experiences, based on reactions to political movements, and even original music pieces based on whatever the artist wanted to make. These commissions were not quoted in the number I quoted earlier. Arena is a powerhouse in creating new work with writers, and our community engagement program also has created 2 absolutely gorgeous films. One of the original music videos was a deeply moving piece by the Banksons, My Joy is Heavy. Sean and Abigail Bankson told their personal story about their loss of a pregnancy. We've now commissioned them for a full-length play. which they've chosen to be an outgrowth of My Joy is Heavy. Miscarriage is one of those human experiences that we don't talk about in public, and we should. This video opened the eyes of many to the pain and the joy. And since the creation of My Joy is Heavy, Abigail Bengtson became pregnant again, and they welcomed a new child into their family 6 months ago. So the theater piece will also be about this new life. My Body, No Choice. This was my moment to stand in the fire of my ideas. In the wake of the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, I felt it was essential that we raise women's voices about the impact of these decisions on our bodies. Some of the men I spoke with after seeing it admitted they understood intellectually what women were going through. However, the monologues socked them in the gut and made the force of sovereignty over one's body real and unforgettable for them. It's the power of theater. This project was done in one-night readings all over the country in 31 communities in the run-up to the midterms. Radical acts. We're working with Cheryl West on a new commission around the January 6th insurrection. This also is a co-commission, this time with La Jolla Playhouse in California. And you're likely well familiar with Cheryl's work because we've collaborated many times over the years. We counted 7 productions. Her Fannie Lou Hamer, Speak on It, with Ife Butler, was performed outside during the height of the pandemic, over on the wharf. Other productions include Aquila and the Bee, Pullman Quarter Blues, Holiday Heart. In fact, Cheryl was a member of the inaugural group of Alan Lee Hughes Fellows over 30 years ago. So you can see these relationships are long-lasting and productive. We also have had a fruitful commissioning relationship with Karen Zacharias. We commissioned her in 2007 for a topic she was passionate about, women in science. Legacy of Light combines science and motherhood in a provocative way and reminds us that our learning of the universe is endless and that there are many, many ways to be a mother. This is a thoroughly modern play, even though it spans almost 300 years, has radical shifts in moral codes and hopscotches between France and America. It's been produced countless times around the United States since we commissioned it, often in universities. We also commissioned Karen in 2003 for Destiny of Desire, a really fun and wild story in the style of a telenovela. I was instantly intrigued. I want to produce stories at Arena we haven't seen before. And my guess is that none of you had seen a telenovela on stage, just in a small screen. It's because there weren't any. Karen surprised us again with this delightful and complex story peopled by characters who keep changing shape. Now, we produced the premiere in 2015, which was a feature as part of the Women's New Voices Play Festival, an area-wide festival here in metropolitan area, started by 7 artistic directors, highlighting 50 women playwrights in 50 theaters, because only 20% of all plays being produced in America are by women. Terrible, right? We wanted to change that. That festival led to 50 premieres and a wealth of new work being produced around the country from DC Festival. And happily, people kept saying, gee, women's playwriting is just like men's storytelling. Since then, Destiny of Desire has been staged countless times around the country, most recently in production at the Old Globe with Ruben Santiago Hudson directing right now. More coming. Radical acts. Arena had a grant for playwright residencies for several years with the American Voices New Play Institute through the Mellon Foundation. This grant was created for Arena Stage. We were the first theater in America to offer writers a living wage for a full year to write whatever they wanted, and healthcare and housing if they wanted to research in DC. Lynn Nottage was one of our resident playwrights. She'd previously been commissioned by Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and Arena joined that commission to support her work during her residency. The result of that was the Pulitzer Prize-winning Sweat. Possibly Arena's most famous example of supporting a commissioned new play came to Edgar Dobie and me from the producer Stacy Mindich and became the Tony Award-winning Dear Evan Hansen. When Arena was approached, music and books were still very much in process, and Arena played a major role in all elements of the development of the piece before the premiere in the Krieger Theater. Right down to the dear Evan Hansen blue and white striped button-down polo shirt, which went from Arena to New York, to London, and around the US. So now the original shirt and the iconic cast that he has on his arm are housed in Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Crazy, right? Among its many awards, it won 3 Tony Awards, including Best Musicals, and 2 of London Theatre's Olivier Awards, also including Best New Musical. In 2018, we premiered the musical Dave, based on the film about a regular guy who steps in for the president. The show had a great run here. It had lots of support. However, it's still waiting for its chance in New York. So really, sometimes it takes years to get the right theater available at the right time. Think about last summer's smash hit, American Prophet, which is also primed for great things. What's next? What's next? While these partnerships with commercial producers are not the main way that Arena brings life to work, Arena has built a reputation as a place that provides a wonderful, nurturing environment for these artists, where artists can create their dreams on stage. Why is programming like this important for the ongoing life of a legendary theater like this one? Well, a theater isn't legendary for being a building. The Mead Center is beautiful, but it's what's inside with you all and with the projects that sustains it. These voices sustain it. I'm immensely proud of what's been accomplished under my tenure here, and I'm confident that my successor, Hannah Sharif, will nourish it and keep these voices singing. Radical acts indeed. Thank you.